All right, let's begin chapter 27. And in this chapter, we're going to take a look at a pretty fundamental model within macroeconomics, and that's the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. But before we do, we're going to take a little bit of a detour and look at some of the historical development of macro, how it came about. So let's keep going. In this caption, we're going to discuss historical developments in macroeconomic theory. Yes. Explain the shape of the aggregate demand curve and what factors shift the curve. Yep. Explain the shape of short-run aggregate supply. What factors shift it. We're going to explain the shape of long-run aggregate supply curve and what can shift the long-run aggregate supply. And we're going to show the effects of shifts of aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve on price level, output, both in the short run and the long run. We're also going to relate this aggregate supply, aggregate demand model to the short run business cycles that we talked about earlier and the long run growth that we talked about earlier. All right, we'll explain some of the dynamic feedback that can destabilize an economy. All right, and discuss some of the limitations of macroeconomic policy. So let's begin. Kind of modern macroeconomics really starts with the Great Depression. We have a deep recession that began in 1929. And, well, it just was a recession. There was nothing all that special about the Great Depression in 1929. Yeah, I mean, there was some issues in housing markets. There were some issues in other financial markets, and it was a recession that was really sparked by problems within the financial markets. All right, so the financial side of the economy. So that's very similar to, say, the latest recession that we had that began, say, in late 2007, beginning in 2008. Into 2008 is kind of where that starts, somewhere in there. But really, there was nothing that remarkable about it in 29. But then it just goes on and on and on and gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And so one of the questions is, so why does it do this? Taking a look at it, output fell by 30%. Unemployment rose to 25%, and that's probably understated. It was a defining event that undermined people's faith in markets and how economies worked. And it really sparked a huge, I don't know what the right word is, a paradigm shift in how macroeconomists really thought about how the macroeconomy works. So it led to an emphasis on short-run and demand-side economy and the development of macroeconomic theory separate from microeconomics. So really up until this point, there is no such thing really as macroeconomics. You have micro theory, and then we sometimes spend some time thinking about how to aggregate over lots of people or lots of goods to get kind of pseudo-macro theory. But we don't really start to think about macroeconomics as its own separate science until the Great Depression. So let's think about very early in economic theory. Let's think about the earlier economists who focus on long-run issues. Markets were self-regulating through this invisible hand idea that we credit all the way back to Adam Smith. And the economy would always return to its potential output and target rate of unemployment in the long run. Because in the long run, all the short-run stuff that gets in the way, the turbulence, works itself out. All right, they blame depression on labor unions, on government policies preventing prices from falling. And they advocate very much a laissez-faire or hands-off economic policy. Well, after the Great Depression hit, we start to see these types of policies. People start to wonder, is this really true? All right, is it possible that the economy can get so messed up that this self-regulating through this invisible hand just won't work? Or if it will work, will it cost us so much that we're unwilling to pay that the price for allowing the economy to self-correct itself? And that's really the essence of where Keynesian economics comes out. So this is a school of thought that's very much attributed to John Maynard Keynes. He writes a book, publishes a book in 1936. Generally, we just call it the general theory. The name of it is the general, I don't even remember what the name of it is, General Theory of Interest, Unemployment, and Money, or something like that. But we talk about it, we just call it general theory. And the problems of the Depression require a short run rather than a long run focus. So Keynes really for the first time starts to think, well, wait a minute, we've got a business cycle. And we need to pay attention to that business cycle. We can do things and we can make policy changes to help make the recessions less costly and the expansions longer and less explosive. So, Keynes, a famous statement when talking about long run versus short run, he says, in the long run, we'll all be dead. Adjustments to the equal, and basically what this is encapsulating is this idea that, yes, in the long run, the economy will self-correct itself eventually, but that might be 100 years from now. That process, that self-correcting process, is essentially very slow. And then we can actually go on a little bit further and say that, well, but sometimes the dynamics within the economy causes these disvirtuous cycles. All right, or a vicious cycle where the economy just spins out of control. So adjustment to equilibrium for a single market, micro issue, and the aggregate economy, macro issue, are different. So here we've got this idea, the fallacy of composition, that the parts sum up to the whole. Well, the problem is sometimes in complex systems, like the macroeconomy, the whole can sometimes behave differently than what the individual systems, or the individual parts of that system will behave. And so we've got a real battle here between the idea of micro foundations of macro. So that macroeconomics is really just a dimensional reduction or an aggregation over many different dimensions, many agents, people, firms, governments working in the economy, and many goods, right? Versus the idea that, well, yes, you can aggregate over this and you can bring all this micro theory up to the macro level, but not all of it comes, right? So the macro economy is just different, and they should be just studied completely differently. So Keynes argued that in times of recession, spending in public goods that benefit everyone. Essentially, his argument was that we need to manage something we call aggregate demand, or demand for goods. So when there was more goods in the economy being supplied than what were being demanded, so that's a recession, right? In that case, so that actual equilibrium output in the short run was below our potential, so that we have unemployment above the target rate, well, the government should step in and stimulate the economy. They should try to fill that gap, and then when we have the opposite, a boom, they can reduce spending and try to even out that business cycle. So short-run equilibrium income may differ from long-run potential income, which is very true. We're going to show this in a model in just a minute. So defining this, equilibrium income is the level of income towards which the economy gravitates. In the short run, because of the cumulative cycles of declining or increasing production. Potential income is the level of income that the economy technically is capable of producing without generating accelerating inflation. So if you think about this, and it's going to make much more sense when we actually get to the model, and I can show you a graph. We think about equilibrium income as where we're actually at right now. That's how much output we're really producing. All right. Potential is how much output we can produce sustainably in the long run. Market forces may not be strong enough to get the economy out of a recession. So sometimes the whole idea behind Keynesianism is that the economy can get so messed up that it needs some medicine to make it better. All right. You need some kind of policy, macroeconomic policy, that can help push it out of the recession. So a really, really classic example of where a complex system behaves differently than the individual parts of the system, all right, the individual actors within the system. So the macroeconomy, the outcome is a little bit different than the individuals, is something called the paradox of thrift. And it goes something like this. So in the long run, savings leads to investment and growth. In the short run, savings may lead to a decrease in spending, output, and employment. Well, how is that? Well, the idea here is if everybody saves more, then what happens? Everybody's spending goes down. And if your spending goes down, well, then what happens to aggregate demand? Well, the demand for overall goods and services goes down. Well, if we want less stuff, we buy less stuff, equilibrium income is going to be reduced. Equilibrium production, GDP, income, those are all kind of identically equal to one another. So I'll use them interchangeably. That will go down. Well, if income goes down, then what happens to savings? Savings goes down, right? So in the short run, we see something very much different happening at the aggregate level than we see happening at the individual's level. So we can see everyone's saving a greater percentage of their income at the individual level, and then overall savings at the aggregate level go down, which is a little weird. That's why we call this the paradox of thrift. Now, it's been shown that this is very much a short-run phenomenon. If savings rates go up in the long run, that does lead to investment and can lead to more growth. But the short-run response of the economy is very different than what we might expect. So aggregate demand management, which is government's attempt to control the aggregate level of spending, may be necessary. So there are times when we want the government to come in and either stimulate more spending or try to retard spending in order to manage either the downside risk of recession or the upside risk of inflation. All right, I'll talk a little bit more about downside risk and upside risk when we talk about policy. All right, Keynesian economists advocate an activist demand management policy. All right, so the Keynesian idea is that self-regulating part to the economy is fairly slow. And because it's slow, it makes recessions very costly. And because they're so costly, we should get in and actively try to manage the economy, manage the business cycle. We should dampen the business cycle out as much as possible.